August 1942, Central Mediterranean, the sea was burning in the late haze of an August afternoon. The convoy crawled forward, steel hulls groaning under the weight of exhaustion and salt. Above them, the sun hung like a molten coin, shimmering over a horizon haunted by smoke trails and drifting wreckage. The Mediterranean, usually a deep, quiet blue, now churned with the scars of war. Oil slicks clung to the waves. Lifeboats bobbed empty, their oars drifting like broken bones. At the heart of this battered line staggered one ship's low, wounded, refusing to sink. Her decks were twisted, her turbines barely alive, and her crew moved with the hollow-eyed determination of men who understood the stakes. Ahead lay Malta, a starving island gasping under relentless siege. Behind them stretched hundreds of miles of enemy waters filled with submarines, bombers, and torpedo boats. Everything depended on whether this single ship could survive one more night, and as the sun dipped, the sky turned the color of rust, an omen that the final onslaught was coming. The convoy braced itself, because if this ship failed, Malta would fall, and the entire balance of the Mediterranean war would shift with it, leading us directly into the deeper story behind this desperate journey. By the summer of 1942, Malta was dying. For months, the island had endured one of the most concentrated bombing campaigns of the entire war. Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica pilots attacked in waves that seemed endless, sometimes 6, 7, even 10 raids a day. Hangars collapsed into twisted frames. Runways disappeared under craters. The once busy harbors of Valletta and Marsamxett filled with shattered hulls and burnt-out cranes. Civilians moved through the stone streets like ghosts, carrying water in tin cans, rationing bread until it became little more than a memory. Malta's strategic position made it both a shield and a target. Situated in the middle of the Mediterranean, it sat directly on the Axis supply route from Italy to North Africa. From this rocky perch, British aircraft and submarines struck convoys bound for Rommel's Africa Corps, sinking fuel tankers and ammunition ships that the desert armies desperately needed. Every torpedo launched from a Maltese submarine pen echoed across 2 continents, influencing battles hundreds of miles away. And Hitler knew it. If Malta survived, the Axis grip on North Africa would weaken. If Malta fell, German and Italian forces could rebuild their momentum and potentially threaten Egypt, the Suez Canal, and the entire Allied position in the region. Thus, the siege became merciless. Fuel on the island dropped to a few days' supply. Aircraft were grounded before they could even take off. Anti-aircraft batteries rationed shells, firing only when absolutely necessary. Food shortages reached a point where even military personnel were receiving starvation-level rations. Some civilians boiled grass to stretch their meals. Priests buried the dead in mass graves because there was no time or space for anything else. The British command understood that, without a successful relief convoy, Malta would not last another month. Several attempts had already failed. Operation Harpoon had been savaged in June, with most of its ships sunk or damaged before they could reach the island. Operation Vigorous, approaching from the east, had been forced to turn back after relentless air attacks and the threat of Italian surface forces. The Mediterranean, once called Mare Nostrum by the Romans, had become a killing ground where convoys disappeared beneath the waves faster than they could be organized. But the situation in July was so severe that the Admiralty prepared one more attempt, a final gamble with enormous stakes. This would be Operation Pedestal. The convoy would be unlike any that had sailed before. 14 merchant vessels would carry fuel, grain, ammunition, aircraft parts, medical supplies, and every other necessity required to keep Malta alive. They would be escorted by one of the largest naval protection forces assembled during the war, 2 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, multiple cruisers, and dozens of destroyers. It was a floating fortress, a steel corridor pushing across hostile waters. Built to withstand the combined fury of German and Italian forces. Yet even this armada be vulnerable. The central Mediterranean was a narrow gauntlet. Axis airfields in Sicily and Sardinia sat close enough to launch constant attacks. Submarines prowled the deep channels. Motor torpedo boats waited along the North African coast. And Italian surface ships, including the remnants of their once proud battle fleet, were prepared to strike if given the chance. British intelligence warned that the enemy would throw everything at this convoy. They predicted heavy losses. They predicted a desperate struggle. But they also knew that there was no alternative. Every commander, from the highest admiral to the youngest midshipman, understood what failure meant. Malta starving. Allied submarines silenced, the Axis supply lines flowing freely, and the North African battlefield swinging decisively toward Rommel. And so, on August 3, 1942, the ships gathered at the River Clyde in Scotland. Crews loaded cargo holds with fuel drums, crates of wheat, and machinery. RAF personnel prepared replacement aircraft, securing them onto deck platforms. Sailors took their stations, knowing the odds, but determined to see the mission through. The convoy pushed south, threading through the Atlantic and into the Strait of Gibraltar. As they entered the Mediterranean, the sailors could almost feel the crosshairs tightening around them. Radio intercepts hinted at rising Axis activity. Reconnaissance reports confirmed aircraft massing on Sicilian runways. The sea ahead seemed deceptively calm blue, shimmering. Hiding the dangers beneath, every man on board knew that the worst was yet to come. And at the center of these preparations was one vessel whose importance exceeded them all. A tanker carrying the lifeblood Malta needed. More than anything else, dash fuel. It would soon become the single most hunted ship on the Mediterranean, and its fate would define Operation Pedestal. Itself, as the convoy moved deeper into the Mediterranean. The threat tightened with every passing hour. The ships advanced in rigid formation, their wakes carving pale lines through the calm surface. Above them, carrier aircraft circled in protective arcs, engines humming like distant warnings. The officers on the bridge knew that this uneasy quiet would not last. The enemy was watching. By August 10th, signals intelligence confirmed that German and Italian forces were preparing a coordinated assault. Luftwaffe torpedo bombers from Sicily practiced low-level strikes. Italian Savoia Marchetti crews checked their radio-guided torpedoes. Submarines slid silently from their pens, their commanders briefed on estimated convoy positions. The Regia Marina assembled fast attack craft along the Tunisian coastline. Even long-range reconnaissance aircraft began shadowing the Allied ships. Their distant silhouettes, glinting briefly in the sun before disappearing into cloud layers. The convoy pressed on. Among the merchant vessels was the heavy tanker SS Ohio, an American-built ship temporarily manned by a British crew. She carried the most precious cargo of the entire operation, aviation fuel. Without it, Malta's surviving Spitfires and Hurricanes would remain grounded, allowing Axis bombers to dominate the skies uncontested. Ohio's tanks held the difference between an active air defense and helpless surrender. Her survival mattered more than any other single vessel, but she was slow. Her engines were powerful, but not designed for tight naval formations. She struggled to maintain the convoy's top speed, forcing escorts to adjust constantly. And because every Axis pilot understood what she carried, she became the prime target long before the first bomb fell. The opening strikes came near dusk. A formation of Italian torpedo bombers swept in low, skimming the water's surface. Their engines roared across the convoy like thunder rolling over metal. British carriers launched fighters to intercept them, but some attackers slipped through. Torpedoes streaked across the waves, white trails slicing toward the escorts. Destroyers maneuvered violently, turning hard to evade. A plume of water erupted beside HMS Ithuriel as a torpedo detonated harmlessly in her wake. The convoy survived the first wave, but the message was clear. The attacks had begun. Night offered no protection. Axis submarines waiting in ambush positions along the convoy's predicted path began their silent hunt. One merchant ship, the SS Deucalion, was struck after dark, her hull cracking open with a deep metallic shudder. Sailors scrambled to contain flooding, but the damage grew too severe. Orders were given to abandon ship. Her loss carried a heavy cost more food and fuel slipping beneath the surface by dawn. The sea around the convoy was scattered with rafts, debris, and drifting oil patches. Yet the formation tightened. No ship could afford to fall behind. Every gap risked creating a vulnerable pocket for torpedo bombers to exploit. On August 11th, the enemy returned in greater force. This time, German Ru-87 Stukas and Ru-88 bombers dove from the sky in screaming arcs. Anti-aircraft guns on cruisers and destroyers opened fire, creating a dense curtain of flak. Shell bursts peppered the air with black smoke. Some attackers broke formation under the storm of explosions, but others pressed on, releasing bombs that tumbled toward the ships below. The carrier HMS Indomitable suffered serious damage, fires erupting along her deck. Several escorts were hit, their superstructures splintered by shrapnel. Still, the convoy moved forward. The Axis command sensed opportunity. Each successful attack encouraged another. Italian torpedo boats raced from their coastal bases, making daring nighttime runs to hurl explosive charges into the Allied screen. E-boats skimmed over the waves, firing torpedoes at close range. The escorts counterattacked, dropping depth charges that thundered through the water. Throughout these chaotic hours, the Ohio remained the focus of nearly every strike. Bomb blasts hammered her. Shockwaves cracked bulkheads. One attack left her engines temporarily disabled, forcing crews to fight through ruptured pipes and flooding compartments to keep her moving. At one point, she was hit so hard that she seemed to sag in the middle, her steel frame bending under the stress. Yet somehow, she stayed afloat by August 12th. The convoy was approaching the most dangerous stretch of its journey, the narrows off Cape Bon. Here, enemy aircraft from both Sicily and Tunisia could converge. Submarines lurked in deeper waters. Fast torpedo boats hit along the coast. Every element of Axis power could strike at once, if the convoy could push through this gauntlet. Malta lay within reach, but the enemy was waiting with its strongest blow. And when it came, it would shatter the convoy and leave the Ohio fighting for survival against overwhelming odds, setting the stage for the desperate struggle that defined Operation Pedestal. Life aboard the Ohio during Operation Pedestal was a constant negotiation between fear and endurance. The men on board were not trained naval warriors, but merchant sailors and Royal Navy volunteers thrust into a battlefield where every sound carried danger. When bombs fell, the entire ship shuddered as though gripped by some violent, unseen force. Plates shook loose. Lights flickered. Pipes burst in sprays of steam. The smell of aviation fuel seeped into every corridor, carrying the terrifying promise that a single spark could end everything in an instant. The crew learned to move with caution. They walked with hands braced against bulkheads, listening for changes in the ship's rhythm. Engines thumped unevenly, metal groaned, and the hull creaked under the weight of battle damage. Sleep came in short, restless moments, often interrupted by the wail of sirens or the distant rumble of approaching aircraft. Some men slept in their clothes, boots on, ready to bolt to stations at a moment's notice. Yet, amid the chaos, a shared determination held them together. They worked side by side, patching leaks, hauling lines, clearing debris, and carrying wounded shipmates to makeshift medical stations. Courage became a quiet, steady thing felt in the way a man held a wrench despite trembling hands. Or in the way, another stepped forward to plug a ruptured fuel line no one else dared approach. Every task carried risk, but no one faltered. They knew what the loss of the Ohio meant. They knew Malta's fate depended on their survival. That knowledge became the anchor that kept them steady when the sea around them erupted in fire, and as the attacks intensified, their resolve only sharpened, preparing them for the escalating violence that awaited them further ahead. Operation Pedestal forced the Allies into one of the most unforgiving tactical environments of the Mediterranean War. The route to Malta was narrow, hemmed in by enemy-controlled coastlines and airfields. Every mile carried overlapping threats: torpedo bombers from the north, submarines ahead, and fast attack craft sweeping in from the south. The escorts had to weave a path through an invisible maze of danger while protecting the slow-moving merchant ships. Pinned at the convoy's center, no commander could rest. Radar operators scanned constantly for incoming aircraft. Lookouts strained their eyes, watching the horizon for the silhouettes of torpedo boats or the periscope glint of a lurking submarine. Destroyers zigzagged in rapid patterns, their wakes cutting erratic lines across the water as they tried to intercept predicted torpedo paths. Cruisers shifted positions to strengthen vulnerable sectors. Every adjustment risked creating a gap elsewhere, and the enemy exploited even the smallest weakness. The Axis forces had the advantage of proximity. Aircraft launched from Sicily could reach the convoy within minutes. Submarines stationed off Cape Bon lay perfectly positioned to attack from multiple angles. Italian Moz boats darted in like wolves, firing torpedoes before retreating at high speed. The convoy's escorts had to manage all of these threats while keeping formation tight enough to shield the merchant ships. For the Ohio, the tactical picture was even harsher. Her importance made her a magnet for enemy fire. Escorts formed a protective screen around her, but they could not intercept every torpedo or bomb. She took hits that would have sunk most tankers. Still, she stayed afloat. Tactical maneuvers saved her more than once, destroyers racing alongside her to push her clear of torpedo tracks, or firing rapid bursts of anti-aircraft fire to drive off diving Stukas. Each minute survived was a tactical victory. Each mile gained felt like a small miracle. The Ohio was built for long-range endurance, not frontline combat. She was a fast, modern tanker, but her design prioritized cargo capacity and stability over armor. Her hull was strong for commercial standards, yet thin compared to naval vessels. Her decks lacked reinforced plating. Her superstructure offered little protection against shrapnel. Every bomb that landed near her sent vibrations echoing through her steel frame, testing rivets and seams that were never meant to bear such violence. Her greatest vulnerability lay in her cargo. Aviation fuel flowed through pipes that ran below deck, and storage tanks filled most of her interior space. A single direct hit could ignite the ship in a fireball large enough to engulf nearby escorts. The engineers understood this. They treated every impact with urgency, racing to check valves, tighten fittings, and patch ruptures before fumes could build. The ship's pumps worked non-stop, shifting fuel between compartments to maintain balance as damage worsened. Yet the Ohio also possessed a few critical strengths. Her engines, though battered, were powerful enough to force her through rough water. Her compartments, carefully sealed, allowed her to resist flooding longer than expected. And her crew, knowing she had no natural defenses, compensated with tireless labor. They turned her into a fighting vessel through sheer determination, rigging improvised supports, welding plates over damaged sections, and operating equipment under conditions no designer had imagined. Still, the ship weakened with every strike. Bomb blasts bent her deck. Torpedoes shook her keel. Fires scorched her paint until the metal beneath glowed. Her speed dropped. Steering became erratic. Some compartments flooded uncontrollably by the time she approached the narrows off Cape Bon. The Ohio was a ship on the edge of structural failure, yet still carrying the fuel that Malta needed to stay alive. Her fragility turned her into both the convoy's greatest asset and its most desperate liability to the Axis command. Operation Pedestal represented an opportunity to deliver a decisive blow in the Mediterranean. They understood that Malta was more than an island. It was a strategic dagger pointed at their supply lines. If they could choke it into submission, the entire North African campaign could shift in their favor. This urgency drove a level of coordination that the Allies had rarely seen, German and Italian. Forces worked together with unusual cohesion. Airfields across Sicily operated in near-continuous rotation. Bombers launched in staggered waves to ensure that the convoy never found a moment's rest. Stukas dove with terrifying precision, their howling sirens echoing across the water. Torpedo bombers swept in low, skimming the sea in tight formation, releasing weapons that threaded through the convoy like hunting sharks. Meanwhile, Italian naval units carried out daring nighttime attacks. Moz boats, small and fast, darted into the convoy's protective ring, releasing torpedoes before slipping back into the darkness. Submarines, alerted by reconnaissance planes, maneuvered into firing positions hours ahead of the convoy's arrival. Even the Italian heavy ships rarely deployed in such operations prepared to sortie if the situation demanded. The Axis pilots showed remarkable persistence. Many returned to their bases with torn wings, damaged engines, or empty fuel tanks. Others never returned at all, lost in flames or swallowed by the sea. But new formations replaced them quickly. The sky over the convoy became a rotating arena of machines diving, climbing, circling, and attacking without pause. Their goal was simple: isolate the Ohio. Disable her escorts and sink her at any cost. Every attack brought them closer to success. Every explosion shook the convoy's nerves. Every torpedo that missed by yards tightened the pressure further. The Axis resolve turned the final approach to Malta into a crucible one where the Ohio would soon face the most ferocious assault of the entire mission. The narrows off Cape Bon turned the sea into a battlefield by dawn on August 13th. The convoy had already endured 2 days of punishment, but nothing compared to what awaited them now. The Axis command committed its full strength to stopping the remaining ships before they could reach Malta. The air grew thick with heat and tension. Smoke clung to the horizon. The sea carried the metallic smell of fuel and the drifting haze of earlier explosions. At the center of the tightening formation, the Ohio struggled forward, her hull sagging, her engines coughing unevenly. She had been hit repeatedly bombs, near misses, machine gun bursts, but she refused to die. Her crew patched holes, reinforced beams with whatever scrap they could find, and fought fires with scorched hands and salt water. Every hour she survived brought Malta another breath of hope. Then the sky darkened. Massive formation of German Ru-87 Stukas descended out of the sun, their sirens screaming. Below them, Italian torpedo bombers moved in low, preparing for a coordinated strike. It was the most concentrated attack of the entire operation. The escorts opened fire instantly. Cruisers hurled shells upward, filling the air with black bursts. Destroyers stitched the sky with streams of tracer fire. The sea boiled with flak fragments. Yet the attackers did not break. They came in disciplined waves, first the Stukas diving steeply toward the escorts. Then the torpedo bombers sweeping in toward the merchants. The Ohio became the focal point again. A bomb smashed into her deck, tearing a crater through steel plating and sending fuel sloshing dangerously close to open flame. A shockwave ripped along her length, warping the deck so severely that her mast tilted. The crew staggered, many thrown to the floor. But the ship stayed afloat. Another Stuka came screaming down. Its bomb hit the water beside the hull, the explosion lifting the tanker sideways. The blast shattered lifeboats, twisted railings, and punched a hole below the waterline. Compartments began to flood. Engineers raced to contain it, closing bulkheads and rigging makeshift pumps. Then came the torpedoes, Italian. Bombers released multiple torpedoes at close range. Escorts maneuvered frantically to intercept, their engines roaring as they threw themselves into danger. HMS Penn and HMS Bramham surged toward the Ohio, trying to screen her. A torpedo trail passed between them, missing the tanker by meters. Another detonated prematurely after taking a burst of gunfire. Still the attacks kept coming. One torpedo. Bomber lined up perfectly with the Ohio's starboard side. Her anti-aircraft gunners fired desperately, but the plane held course. At the last moment, a British fighter swooped down from above, its guns ripping through the bomber's fuselage. The Italian aircraft burst into flames and crashed into the sea, passing so close that burning debris showered across the tanker's deck, but the Ohio's luck could not hold forever. Stuka dive bomber struck her midships with a direct hit. The explosion was catastrophic. The blast tore through internal frames, ripping open pipes and sending fuel gushing across the deck. Fire flared immediately, whipped by wind into a roaring sheet. Men scrambled with hoses, sandbags, anything they could grab. Flames licked toward the fuel tanks, threatening to ignite the entire cargo. For a moment, it seemed certain the ship would explode. Miraculously, the crew contained the fire, beating it back inch by inch until the deck was blackened but stable. The Ohio still floated, though barely. Her engines failed shortly after the blast, leaving her dead in the water. The escorts circled desperately. They could not tow her under such intense attack, yet they could not abandon her either. Malta needed her. Without her fuel, the island's air defenses would collapse. The entire purpose of Operation Pedestal centered on this wounded ship. As if sensing the Ohio's vulnerability, the Axis launched another coordinated strike. Italian fighters strafed the deck. German bombers dropped more loads. One near miss cracked her keel so severely that officers feared she would break in too. Her captain, Dudley Mason, refused to give the order to abandon ship. "Keep her afloat," he told his men, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. But the Ohio could no longer move under her own power. Flames smoldered from earlier strikes. Flooding worsened. Her bow dipped dangerously into the water. The horizon shimmered with the silhouettes of more incoming aircraft. The convoy pushed on, forced to leave her temporarily behind. It seemed the Ohio's journey had ended alone, shattered and drifting. But her ordeal was not finished, because within hours a desperate rescue attempt would begin. One that would either save Malta or end with the Ohio sinking beneath the waves. The Ohio's survival depended on improvisation, courage, and sheer determination. As the convoy drew closer to Malta's southern approaches, the remaining escorts returned. HMS Bramham and HMS Penn closed in, preparing the impossible to tow a crippled tanker under enemy fire. Crews lashed tow lines through the twisting decks, bracing against the heat, smoke, and ongoing strafing. Every man knew the risk. One misstep could snap the cables, sending the Ohio to the depths and taking dozens with her. But without her, Malta would not survive. The Axis sensed the Ohio's vulnerability and renewed their attacks. Stukas dived in screaming arcs. Torpedo bombers skimmed the water, and Italian fighters strafed the decks. Anti-aircraft guns from the escorts and the few operational guns on the Ohio fired continuously. Explosions rocked the sea around them, sending spouts of water and shrapnel into the air. At times, the tanker veered dangerously, almost colliding with the destroyers attempting the tow. Crews worked with extraordinary coordination. Sailors from HMS Bramham and HMS Penn manned tow ropes. while Ohio's men patched fresh holes, controlled flooding, and kept fires from reaching the fuel tanks. Every wave of attack brought new injuries and fatigue. Hands blistered, faces blackened with smoke. Yet the ship inched forward, defying physics and probability alike. At one point, the Ohio nearly capsized under the strain. Her engine rooms were flooded, the structural integrity compromised, and the weight of fuel unevenly distributed. Yet the crew held her steady, using ropes, improvised braces, and sheer muscle power to keep her on course. The escorts adjusted constantly, creating a protective screen that allowed the tanker to remain in one piece. Despite sustained bombing and torpedo attacks by the afternoon of August 13th, the convoy entered the relatively safer waters near Malta. Axis attacks persisted, but the island's coastal batteries joined the defense. Anti-aircraft fire from Valletta and Sanglia created a dense barrier in the sky. Allied fighter squadrons from the island took to the air, intercepting enemy planes before they could dive. Each mile gained felt like a victory. Finally, the Ohio crossed the breakwater into Valletta's Grand Harbor. Exhausted men collapsed on deck. The battered ship had endured direct hits, torpedoes, near misses, fires, and flooding, but she remained afloat. The aviation fuel she carried, worth more than the lives of hundreds, was delivered. Malta could fight another day. The impact was immediate. Spitfires and Hurricanes, grounded for weeks, received the fuel needed to patrol the skies again. Anti-aircraft batteries regained mobility. Supply lines, though tenuous, could now support the island's defenders. For Malta, the Ohio was more than a ship, was survival incarnate, a floating lifeline that defied destruction. Operation Pedestal had been a costly gamble. Many ships were lost. Sailors and airmen had died in staggering numbers. But the Ohio's arrival changed everything. It preserved Malta as a strategic base, kept Allied submarines operating in the central Mediterranean, and maintained the pressure on Axis supply routes to North Africa. In the wider context of the war, this single ship, built for trade, not combat, had become a decisive weapon in the battle for the Mediterranean. The Ohio, battered but alive, symbolized the intersection of courage, technology, and human endurance. Her survival turned what seemed like certain disaster into a narrow, hard-won victory, setting the stage for the aftermath of Operation Pedestal. The wreckage of the convoy told a story of sacrifice. Out of the 14 merchant vessels that had set out on Operation Pedestal, only 5 reached Malta. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were battered, sunk, or heavily damaged. More than 300 men perished during the voyage, with countless others wounded. The Mediterranean, for those few days in August 1942, had become a graveyard of steel, fire, and human endurance. Yet, amid this devastation, the Ohio's survival carried a disproportionate weight. Her cargo of aviation fuel was immediately offloaded and distributed to Malta's airfields. Spitfires and Hurricanes, long grounded due to fuel shortages, roared into the sky once more. The island's air defenses, previously limited to skeletal patrols, could now contest Axis air raids with renewed vigor. Every sortie flown from Malta disrupted Rommel's supply lines, delaying armored advances across the North African deserts and buying critical time for Allied forces. The human cost, however, was seared into memory. Survivors described decks slick with oil, fires still smoldering, and the haunting cries of men lost to the sea. Sailors who had labored around the clock aboard the Ohio remembered the endless struggle against heat, smoke, and water pouring into compartments. The bravery of those men became legend within the Royal Navy. Captain Dudley Mason was later awarded the George Cross, an extraordinary recognition of courage under fire, as his command of the Ohio had directly contributed to the survival of Malta. Strategically, the operation achieved its ultimate goal. Malta remained in Allied hands. The island continued to serve as a base for submarines and aircraft, striking at Axis convoys supplying Rommel's forces in Libya and Egypt. The psychological effect was equally significant. Axis commanders realized that, even under intense pressure, the Allies could deliver critical supplies through the most hostile of environments. It was a demonstration of determination and ingenuity, reinforcing the belief that Malta could not easily be neutralized. The losses, however, could not be ignored. The Royal Navy had paid a high price. Ships sunk during the operation included HMS Eagle, HMS Manchester, and multiple destroyers. Merchantmen, apart from the Ohio, were destroyed, denying vital cargo. The human toll, both military and civilian, underscored the brutal nature of Mediterranean warfare. Every mile of the convoy's journey had been contested. Every man lost was a reminder that survival came at a staggering cost. The arrival of the Ohio also shifted planning for future convoys. Naval commanders reassessed tactics, emphasizing the need for heavier escorts, air cover coordination, and the protection of critical vessels. Lessons learned during Pedestal informed later operations to Malta, including Operation Stone Age and Operation Portcullis, influencing the course of the Mediterranean campaign for months to come. And yet, amidst the wreckage and death, the image of the battered Ohio tugged forward by destroyers became a symbol, a floating monument to human resilience and the precarious balance of strategy, technology, and sheer courage that defined the Mediterranean theater. It was proof that even in the face of overwhelming odds, a single ship, a single crew, and a single mission could alter the trajectory of war. By mid-August 1942, the scale of destruction was fully apparent. The Mediterranean seethed with wreckage. Twisted steel hulks, floating debris, and oil-streaked water marking where ships had been lost. Survivors clung to rafts or drifted toward the nearest coastline, often days from rescue. The human toll weighed heavily on commanders and crews alike, yet the strategic value of the mission remained undeniable. Without the Ohio's delivery, Malta would have been starved into submission. With it, the island's defenses remained active, and Axis supply lines to North Africa were continually harassed. The operational lessons from Pedestal resonated across the Royal Navy. Protecting high-value targets like the Ohio became a tactical priority, emphasizing convoy cohesion, air cover integration, and aggressive anti-submarine maneuvers. The bravery of crews on both merchant and naval ships highlighted the need for rigorous training under extreme conditions. Officers documented every incident of damage control, fire suppression, and improvised towing techniques, ensuring that future convoys could benefit from these hard-earned experiences. Beyond military lessons, the psychological impact on both sides was profound. Malta civilians, though exhausted and starving, drew hope from the tanker's arrival. Rationing continued, but the knowledge that the island could survive inspired morale, cementing their resistance under siege. For the Axis, the operation exposed vulnerabilities in coordination and execution. Even with overwhelming air and naval superiority, they could not prevent the convoy's critical elements from reaching the island. Commanders reevaluated tactics, acknowledging that attrition alone could not guarantee Malta's surrender. The Ohio, battered and scarred, became a living symbol of perseverance. Her crew, many injured and all exhausted, were celebrated upon arrival. Captain Dudley Mason's leadership under fire became emblematic of the courage required in maritime warfare. Ships that had been lost were mourned, but their sacrifices reinforced the narrative of unity and resolve that defined Allied naval operations in the Mediterranean. Every surviving member of the convoy became a testament to the fine line between disaster and success in wartime logistics. Finally, Operation Pedestal's aftermath reverberated strategically. Malta remained a launching point for Allied air and submarine operations directly affecting the North African campaign. Rommel's supply lines remained precarious, and the continued presence of an active Allied base hindered Axis advances. The operation demonstrated that even a high-risk convoy, when meticulously planned and courageously executed, could shape the broader theater of war. The story of the Ohio and her convoy would live on as a reminder of what human courage, determination, and ingenuity could achieve against overwhelming odds a single ship, carrying the lifeblood of an island and the hopes of a campaign. Its survival was more than a tactical success. It was a turning point that preserved Malta and altered the trajectory of the Mediterranean conflict. Operation Pedestal was more than a naval mission, it was a test of endurance, ingenuity, and the human spirit under fire. The Ohio, battered almost beyond recognition, symbolized the precarious balance between life and death, success and failure, in a war defined by precision and chaos. Her survival carried the weight of an entire island and, by extension, the wider Mediterranean campaign. Every sailor, officer, and airman involved became part of a living testament to courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The story of the Ohio illustrates the intersection of strategy, technology, and human determination. She was a commercial tanker pressed into a role for which she was never designed. Yet through extraordinary seamanship, improvisation, and sheer will, she became a decisive instrument of war. The Convoy sacrifices remind us that warfare is rarely dictated by strength alone. Morale, timing, and the resolve of individuals can shape outcomes just as decisively as firepower or numbers. Malta's survival ensured the continuation of Allied pressure on Axis supply lines, keeping Rommel's armies in North Africa constrained and vulnerable. The bravery exhibited during Operation Pedestal became a benchmark for all subsequent Mediterranean convoys, influencing tactics, training, and operational planning for years. It also offered a human lesson, even when the odds are stacked against them. People can accomplish feats that defy expectation, anchored by duty, necessity, and hope. In the grand sweep of history, the Ohio reminds us that small acts of courage can carry immense consequences. One ship, one crew, and one convoy determined the fate of an island, the course of a campaign, and, in subtle ways, the momentum of a war. The roar of engines, the cries of sailors, the crackle of anti-aircraft fire all faded, leaving behind the quiet persistence of a battered vessel afloat against the odds. In that persistence, we see a reflection of humanity itself, resilient, determined, and unyielding even in the darkest hours. Operation Pedestal endures not only as a story of strategy and survival, but as a timeless reminder of what courage, ingenuity, and sacrifice can achieve even when the world seems set against you.